to like be intense about starting on time to convey to people that we start on time. Because these can be long presentations, so it's nice to just, although I'm going to talk a little bit slowly because I see someone running out in a hurry, and I don't want to be mean. Okay, so first off, first week, how are we all? We're good? We're feeling good? You guys all got your quizzes in? I saw that. That was great. We're going to have paper surveys this time just because we love a survey and we would love to know what you think. The Durham County mask mandate says that a speaker, if vaccinated, can take their mask off if they are 10 feet away from the front row. Yay. Hello! Hello, front row. Hi. Although it is fun because we just found out that all of the NC State employees in this building, I'm actually kind of weirdly excited about this. We are now required to be vaccinated or to get tested regularly, although our office is already at 100% vaccination. So, yeah, so I just want to start really quickly. This is a really good book if you're trying to learn botany, if you're serious about this. I would actually say that from a plant identification perspective, understanding the real patterns in botany and how the classifications are laid out is actually one of the absolute most best useful things you can do. With your plant ID, it's really hard at first because everything looks the same and looks different at once, right? You're like, I don't know, I can't make sense of this. But once you start getting better at plant ID and botany, and once you start understanding the underlying patterns, you will get to a point where you're like, I don't know what this is, but based on like form and based on kind of what I consider almost like vibe, I can tell it's in the mint family. I can tell it's in the elm family. I can tell it's in the roses, right? Like I know where to look just based on some of these broad patterns that I know and I understand. And that becomes a much faster way to ID plants because now I don't have to look at all the plants. I have to look at, for example, in the mints, I have to look at the Lamiaceae, right? And then I can do it pretty fast. So this is a great book for that. One of our students last class bought it and he just loved it. He was so fun. He like got I think they're like flashcards too, and he was like, serious. It was really cool. So today is all about botany. This is a talk that is adapted from Charlotte Glenn. She is our state coordinator. She was an agent in Chatham and I believe Pitt County maybe. But for like 20 years before she became the state coordinator, she is wonderful. If you attend Plants, Pests, and Pathogens, you'll see Charlotte. She's absolutely great. Something I wanted to add to this talk that I think is really, really important for us to understand plants in general is that they're really different. That sounds silly, but they are really different than animals. And what do I mean by that? I mean that, so if we think about single-celled organisms, right? This is my like evolutionary biologist coming out. If we think about single-celled organisms, the parts that gave rise to animals and to mushrooms, fungi, right? They're actually, the funguses are more closely related to animals than they are to plants, right? We are of a kind. Plants are all the way, they are in a separate idea, right? Plants are an independent evolution of multicellularity. Their cells are connected different ways. They are using different hormones. They have figured out how to have a bunch of cells together in one organism in a totally different way than animals have, right? So like all of your animal logic doesn't quite apply here. One of the biggest differences you will see with plants that's really, really important is, and this sounds like a small detail, but it is how you build a body. Animal cells move. If we have a wound, new cells can come in and they can heal that wound, they can rebuild that tissue. Plant cells do not move. Once they are in place, they are in place. There's a saying, plants seal, animals heal, right? So if they get a wound, they can't regrow it, they can maybe cordon it off and create a barrier around it. So, right, it's that I think of, you know, if you see where a heart was carved on a tree trunk, that is the height it was carved at. It will not go up, it will not move in any direction. It was right there because those cells are there and they're locked there. And so it's just really helpful to understand, like, plants are doing things really differently than we are, right? And it's actually really, really cool. I think it's one of the reasons I like studying plants in grad school is because it's a totally different logic in a lot of ways. And so just really wanted to impress that upon you guys. So a little bit of today, kind of an overview. We'll be understanding how plants work. Taxonomy, we'll be talking about plant classification systems. This is kind of how plants are organized from a botanist's perspective. We'll also be talking about anatomy, which is plant structures and their functions. This is more like how often a gardener will think about plant organization, right? Because that's kind of, we see what we see, and that's how we classify them, right? And then finally, physiology, which are plant processes. And so we'll be talking about things like photosynthesis, transpiration, respiration, how plants get done, kind of everything that they're doing. This is actually extremely helpful from a gardening perspective because plants have goals and we are trying to help them reach those goals. And so it is helpful to know how they're going about reaching those goals, right? All right, plant classification systems from a botanist perspective. I added this picture. These are all flowers from the Fabaceae, from the legumes. And so one of the things I will certainly impress upon you when we talk about flowers more is that flowers are one of the absolute best ways to figure out where a plant belongs from a taxonomic perspective, from a like, what family are you in, what genus, what species are you? Because flowers are very, very, we call them from an evolutionary perspective, we call it conserved. That means flowers stay the same. Everything else might be changing around it, but a flower stays the same. And the reason for that is the flower is what your pollinator recognizes. A flower is what your reproductive partner recognizes. If that flower changes, right, you might be off in the wilderness and no one knows who you are. Your leaves can change all you want, but your flower has to stay pretty much the same. And so a lot of times you'll see, right, all across these groups there are small changes, but the structures like in here are pretty much similar. If I looked at an individual one of these flowers on this spike, it would look a lot, I would be able to see similarities to this. All right, so simplified plant kingdom. There are the non-vascular plants and the vascular plants. Distinction here is just, do you have vascular tissue or not? Vascular tissue, right, is the xylem, the phloem. It's kind of like what we think of as our blood vessels. It also gives you support, right? So it allows plants to get bigger when they have vascular tissue. Some of the non-vascular plants are the mosses, the liverworts, the hornworts. These are small, low-growing little guys, right? A lot of us don't even really think about them quite in the same group. For vascular plants, we have spore-bearing and seed-bearing. This is a major distinction that like a botanist would see, right? So spore-bearing are going to be things like ferns, club mosses, horsetails, right? I don't ever want, and I'll make this point on a slide later, I don't ever want to say that something is more primitive than something else because everything's been evolving roughly the same amount of time and they all made it up to today. So, like, how are you primitive if you're still here today, right? That's kind of an old evolutionary term. But when we think about the evolution of plants, vascular tissue was a huge thing, right? That allowed plants to get bigger. It allowed them to do different things. Moving from spores to seeds was a huge deal. A spore is tiny, right? It has no real resources with it. It just like hopes for the best, right? Like it just goes out and hopes for the best. A seed packed its lunch, right? It has an endosperm, it has everything else with it. And so it can take in so many different environments. So this allows you, again, to get into new environments. Within the seed bearing, we have gymnosperms and angiosperms. Really the easiest distinction you can think of here is flowering and not flowering quite the same way, right? These are not the ones that have the pretty big flowers that we see. So the gymnosperms are going to be things like conifers, cycads, ginkgo. Ginkgo is one of those ones you'll hear talked about as an ancient plant. Again, it's here, right? It's in our current time. It hasn't changed much that we can tell, but oftentimes there are a lot of things you can't tell from the fossil record, right? I can't tell if the smell has changed from the fossil record, right? So it could still be changing. Within the angiosperms, these are the flowering plants. The major distinction is the monocots or the dicots. Sometimes you'll hear the dicots called the eudicots, EU dicots, true dicots. That is a distinction that like botanists and taxonomists have made recently, but you can think of dicots and eudicots as being very similar. Plant taxonomists are constantly battling about every little detail, and so oftentimes things will get named and renamed, and you just kind of like hang on for the ride, right? So the monocots are things like orchids, lilies, irises, grasses, sedges, palms. We think of them, like if you were to think about it from like a weed perspective, you have grasses and you have broadleafs, right? These are the broadleaf plants. Most plants that we have out in the garden, trees, all this kind of stuff, deciduous trees, for the most part are going to be in the dicots, right? This is really where we're going to spend kind of the majority of our gardening time, and we're going to think about these a fair bit. Although we have a really excellent moss specialist who's a master gardener, and she helps manage the moss gardens over at Duke. And I mean, if you want to do a deep dive on mosses to the point where you will set up a moss garden, we all did. Talk to Flora, which is also delightful that that's her name. So some of the non-vascular plants we talked about, just so you can get a handle on what these look like. Mosses, liverworts, right? So mosses, we've seen liverworts, hornworts, these kind of really weird looking things that they almost look like the creature from the Black Lagoon, right? These are weird, gnarly looking plants, but they're cool, and they like wet areas. The spore-bearing plants, and these are spore-bearing plants, just like the Gymnosperms, or the spore-bearing plants really, really like water, and it's because their spores have to swim through water to find each other. So you will find them in wet areas. You will hear them called primitive. I wouldn't call them primitive, but you will hear them called primitive, and they do give us an idea of what some of the earliest plants might have looked like, right? They didn't look exactly like this, but they looked adjacent to that. Some of the vascular non-seed bearing plants, ferns, club mosses, horsetails, these have spores instead of seeds. So again, where do we see ferns? Where do we see equisedum or horsetails, right? We see them in wet environments. And that's because those spores have to find each other. This is it's what you think of as, right? So the plants got big, that was a huge innovation, and then the plants were able to move away from water. And that was a huge innovation, right? So many of our garden plants, they don't have to grow in standing water or in super moist soils all the time. These guys really need a lot of wetness. Some of the seed-bearing plants, the Gymnosperms, we have Conifers. These are cone-bearing, and they have beetle-like leaves. We have cycads, so sago palms, and we have ginkgo. Ginkgo's a stink pot if you get a female, but you have to have the females too. So one thing I'll note about this is that this is not a fruit in the true sense on the ginkgo, right? It is a structure a lot like a fruit, but because it did not come from a flower, it's not a fruit, right? Like this is like a thing a botanist will always trip you up on is like, but what is the origin of that tissue? And you're like, oh my God, it looks like a fruit, I don't know. And they're like, however. So just be aware of that. It's like how strawberry's not a berry, it's a drupe, because it's shaped slightly differently. Thanks, botanists. So some of the conifers, right, these are all classics. And it's good to note, right, you can have really different needle structures. So you can have almost more of a scaly type needle, you can have a normal needle like you would see on a pine. A few are deciduous. Right? Conifers are not always evergreen. This is a guy that will keep coming up in this talk. Bald cypress. Every year I get calls about someone's bald cypress. They're like, it's dropping all the needles. I'm like, did you just move in? Like, it's okay if you did, but like that's my first question, right? So bald cypress is a really cool guy, and these grow right along the water, and if they're closer and closer to water, they will have these knees that come up in the water, which are really beautiful. If they grow in drier areas, they actually don't develop those knees quite the same way, but that's part of their anchoring root structure and also a way to get air. Some of the flowering plants, it's important to understand that these are developed into monocots and dicots. So a monocot comes out and it has one true seed leaf. So these are going to be, another name for a seed leaf is a cotyledon. Monocotyledon, dicotyledon, that's where that name comes from. So the seed leaf is just that very first leaf that comes out. It's not actually a true leaf. Like it's a little bit of a weird structure that got packaged up in the seed, and it wouldn't be considered a normal leaf. It's a very specialized leaf. So this is going to be things like grasses, lilies, orchids, palms, right? These are your narrow-leaved plants. All their vascular tissue runs in a line, right? Between the monocots and the dicots, they actually do organize their vascular tissue differently. Theirs is all higgledy-piggledy, the monocots, whereas the dicots, it's in like very clean, organized bundles in a ring. No true trees in the monocots. So if you have something that looks like a tree, like some of the weird tropical looking trees. They're not real trees. Shout out if you know one. I feel bad I'm blanking right now. I don't plant them. Dicotyledons, they come out with two true seed leaves. This is most things you grow, right? Beans, marigolds, most plants. For the most part, you're going to see two seed leaves come out. And then above this, you'll see the true leaves coming out. All right, this is what I'm talking about. So the monocots have really, really, really linear vascular tissue. It's all completely in lines. Palms. I'm from Indiana. I never planted a palm in my life. Palms, right, are not true trees, right? Because monocots just don't make true trees. So important to note here, like we were talking about some of the patterns of botany, right? They tend to come in multiples of 3s. So you will have things like 3, 6, 9 petals. You will have 3, 6, 9 floral parts on the inside, right? It's just a way of knowing it. I think the most obvious way of knowing a monocot, again, is that really linear vascular tissue. That's a dead giveaway every single time. But if you just had a flower, right, it's things that look irisy, things that look kind of like lily-ish are always in the monocots. Something to note is that on grasses, these are flowers. They're not showy the same way other flowers are, and sometimes they're much smaller, but those are considered flowers. In the dicots, we have leaf midrib, and this is really the distinction. You have branching off of that midrib, right? So a monocot will always be totally parallel, and a dicot will be branched. Like like to think you'll see it sometimes described as like a webbed vein structure or a branched vein structure. The moment I see veins intersecting, right, I got a dicot. Like I don't actually need to investigate further. They often flower in multiples of 4s or 5s. Things like roses, for example, are always in 5s. So they'll have 5 or 10 petals. They'll have 5 or 10 floral parts, right? They've got their plan and they're sticking to it, and it doesn't matter where you are. This is most of what we're going to be talking about is the most cultivated plants. Take a sip of water. All right, so you're like, okay, that was a lot of botany. Thanks, Ashley. Thanks for that. Apparently, there are things that look like trees. They are not trees. I need to be careful. But this is really, I think, what most of us are going to think about, and this is what most of our questions that we get as master gardeners are going to be about, is plant classification from a gardener's perspective, right? All of the earlier stuff is really, really, really helpful for IDing plants, for understanding plants, for knowing what they like. This is really helpful for answering a client's questions, right? For knowing kind of what they're trying to get at. So we're going to talk a little bit about growth cycles, leaf persistence, so does it hold its leaves or not, and also cold tolerance, and this one's really important for this area. So there are several major growth cycles that plants can have. The first is annuals, obviously. These live one growing season. We can have summer/warm season annuals, or we can have winter or cool season annuals. For the most part, annuals, even if you take them inside, and even if you gave them all the resources they needed, they would peter out and they would die, right? Like their plan is not to live longer than about a year. You might be able to get them going a little bit longer, but they don't want that, right? Like that's not their goal in life, and so they will still die, no matter how much you give them. Biennials, these often have 2 growing seasons. Biennials are actually not terribly common. There are certainly some of them, but most things fall kind of more into the annual or perennial situation. There can certainly be short-lived perennials. These are ones that come back, maybe 4 or 5, 6 years and then kind of peter out. A lot of times you'll see with some of the kind of selected varieties of perennials, so things like coneflower, when you get all those beautiful white coneflowers or colored coneflowers, a lot of times those are short-lived annuals, right? You're going to have that thing for 4 or 5 years and then it's going to kind of give up the ghost, right? They don't live forever, but it's still considered a perennial. Within the perennials, there are 2 major types. There's herbaceous. These die back to roots each year, so this is most of our most of our flowers, this kind of stuff. And then there's woody, which are the ones like trees, shrubs that persist above the ground. So to really understand the difference between the 2 annuals, we have the summer annual, and this guy is going to have seed on the ground in April, or kind of late winter, early spring. Once the ground starts warming up and it gets cues to germinate, it will germinate and it is off to the races, right? Like it is like, I'm gonna germinate, I'm gonna flower, I'm gonna get this done, right? It is happy, and then by the time it gets too hot, or even by the time it cools off considerably, sometime late in the summer, early in the fall, it's dropped that seed and it's gone, and it's not coming back, right? The seed is how it gets into the next generation. Again, take these guys inside, for the most part, they will peter out still, right? Like this is almost like a programmed death at the end because there's no reason for them to keep going. That's in contrast to a winter annual that does the same thing but just over a slightly different schedule, right? So in the cooler weather, it gets the signal, it germinates, it stays as a low, we call it a rosette, a low group of leaves right at the bottom. It stays there all winter, hanging out. And then sometime when it starts warming up in the spring, this is when like your yard gets taken over by henbit or dead nettle. All those purple flowers start showing up, right? And you're like, what? How did this happen? It happened overnight. And you're like, they have been planning this for a while, right? Like, this is a scheme. So I like to just think of these guys as being on a calendar year and these guys as being on a school year. I think it's kind of the easiest way to remember. But either way, they definitely die out. This is why if I get calls and people are freaking out about winter annual weeds in their lawn in April, I'm like, okay, that problem's gonna solve itself. They're gonna die. You can think about how you prevent that problem next fall, but like, I personally wouldn't spray a bunch of stuff to kill a plant that's gonna die in 6 weeks, right? Like, no matter what I do. So, this is something we'll talk about a little bit more when we talk about weed control, but it's really important to know the distinction between these two. That is in contrast to something like a biennial. So a biennial will come up in April or May of the first year, typically. Sometimes it comes up a little bit later, but that's about when it is. This is things like foxglove, right? And then it hangs out as a rosette. It hangs out as this sort of leafy green structure all summer. Through the winter, just doing its thing, building up its resources, getting big and strong, and then when it gets the signal, because it warms up that second year, it just, right, it's off to the races. It's got typically big flower stalks, it's big, it's beautiful, and then it dies out, right? So a lot of times with things like foxglove, we think they're perennials, but it's because they're self-seeding biennials, right, where they're always kind of turning over, they're always reseeding the next couple of years. So in the example of foxglove, right, here's the rosette structure, here is what the flowers look like, they're big and they're showy, and that's kind of one of the ways that you get such a nice big show on some of these plants, is that they had a year to like hang out and think about it, right, and to build up their resources. You also have mullein, which typically sometimes is viewed as more of a weed. You have honesty, we have a number of different plants in this group, but they're not quite as common. Finally, perennials. This is these diagrams actually come from when I teach pesticide safety and when I teach like weed ID for pesticide applicators. And I love them because this is the slide that I'm like, this is your worst case scenario from weed control. So perennials, the thing to know about perennials is that they'll be green and then they'll die back. They'll be green and then they'll die back. And these floating bits, that means that this guy reproduces by seed, he reproduces by stem cuttings, sometimes he can reproduce by root cuttings, right? So if you go in and you're like, oh, I have all these perennial weeds, and you till it up, you had like 3 perennial weeds, now you have like 100, right? Because you cut those roots, and each one of them has a chance of regenerating the plant, right? Perennials will come back and back and back, and this is one of the things we love about them as gardeners, is that they can form nice dense stands, they can do all these beautiful things for us, but from a weed control perspective, they can be pretty dastardly because they spread all the ways, right? They will spread on equipment, they will spread their seed, they'll spread every single way you can get a plant. That's how a perennial wants to do it. So there are 2 major types we think about. We think about herbaceous. These are the guys that are going to die back to the ground, right? Every single year, they look like they disappeared. One thing I will say to be aware of is that, and we'll talk about this a little bit more when we talk about pollinator-friendly practices, is that we're understanding more and more and more that it's actually a really good idea to leave cut stems longer, to leave seed heads on as long as you possibly can tolerate. All sorts of bees and everything else will lay eggs, will nest in those cut stems. The birds will come as they're migrating through, they will eat those seed heads, they will do everything you can. And so I like to really leave most of my like perennial mess until sometime in the spring, and even then when I cut things, I tend to like kind of let them fall where I cut them, so I'm not disrupting too much. It also helps things seed back in better. I know some of us have like a slightly tighter gardening style, but the more we can do to leave things, especially in our native plants, that's actually where a lot of the habitat is. It's not just that they provide nectar, it's that they provide nesting space and everything else. So it's going to include flowering perennials, bulbs, ornamental grasses. I mean, ornamental grasses, there is no reason to cut back an ornamental grass in the winter. Like, that's kind of why you planted it, is that's the winter interest on that plant, right? So just like, let it do its thing, cut it back early in the next year. Some of the woody perennials, the distinction between a tree and a shrub is like, you know it when you see it, kind of. You know, like, so a tree, they are typically much taller, but the small ones can be under 30 feet and they can be multi-trunked. And so something like this crepe myrtle, if they didn't stay on top of, if that thing started putting out suckers and water roots at the bottom and they didn't stay on top of it, that would turn into a shrub, right? These trees do not care what they are shaped like, right? They're not like, I need to have a central leader and a graceful form in the landscape. They're like, I'm trying to make as many leaves as possible to make sugars, right? And they'll do that in whatever form they want to do that in, which is why in our landscapes often we have to really train trees into the right shape, because otherwise they will turn into shrubs because they don't care and they're happy and they're having a good time, right? So I have a whole talk on trees that I love, but it's for another day. Shrubs obviously are lower, and then we also have ground cover and vines. Vines often need support, just be really, really aware of that. Ground covers can be evergreen or not. We all love a good evergreen ground cover when possible. So what do I mean when I'm talking about evergreen versus deciduous? Evergreen keeps some foliage year-round. The broadleaf evergreens, things like azaleas, they typically drop their leaves in the spring. And the needled evergreens, things like pines, drop them in the fall. So this is very important for you to know. You will get calls in the spring. My azalea looks terrible. My sweet bay magnolia, the leaves are yellowing and it looks like it's fit to die. Those are the old leaves. It's dropping them. It will do this every single spring. It will look dramatic every single spring. But it's just because it does drop its leaves. It just doesn't drop them in the fall when we think of it, right? And so this is one that, like, I just go out and my magnolia in the spring, you can tell exactly about how tall I am on my tippy toes because the yellow leaves are above that, right? So I just go through and I pick them out and it's fine. And it's always those, you know, the fresh new leaves are good and green and the old ones are yellow because they're ready to drop. This is in contrast to deciduous, where they're going to lose everything in the fall, right? Evergreen is going to push out the old leaves with the new leaves. Deciduous is going to lose everything in the fall. They grow new leaves each year, and most are broadleaf. A few of needles, again, are, oh, I'm in front of 30 people and I can't remember it. It's got knees, bald cypress. Okay. Nice. Wow. So just be aware, though, that most of these guys, and this is like a great picture of red osier dogwood or red twig dogwood, right? Some of these will even color up really beautifully once they lose their leaves. Some of the Japanese maples do that as well, where you think it's a show in the summer, but in the winter that thing turns a crazy red or a crazy green, and it's just as impressive. There are varieties of this now that go red, yellow, green. I think there might even be a white variety out. So if you want some interest, and this is a native plant, this is a good one, that red twig dogwood. So thinking about hardy versus tender, one thing I want to really draw your attention to is that we're a highly, highly, highly variable or varied state, right? So if you go over into this area and you're in the mountains, there are parts of the mountains that have a climate that is more similar to areas in Ontario, right? Because every time you go up, it's like you go north. It's colder, you have different plants, right? So all the time I will get calls that are like, I just went and visited my friends in the mountains and their rhododendrons are beautiful and I am gonna plant rhododendrons. And I'm like, I mean, try it. Come back when you want something else. Like, you know, we'll talk through what might actually work. Because it's so much cooler here in the same way that the soils over here is sand, right? They're totally different. They're dealing with salt spray, they're dealing with sand, they're dealing with totally different stuff. And so you really want to be thinking about what I like to call, or what I like to think of as our planting region is not North Carolina, it's the Piedmont. And the Piedmont is a soil and climate base that's going to go up all the way into Delaware and it's going to come down like this big stretch. And so I can know that I'm planting plants from the Piedmont and they're going to be roughly right. That's much more accurate than North Carolina. Another thing that can throw you for a loop are these USDA plant hardiness zones. I think many of us have seen this before. In Durham, we are typically considered a 7A or a 7B. Here in downtown Durham, like in many urban areas, we are hotter. I would say we're already well into an 8, if not an 8B. I can plant things here that can't plant in the northern part of the county, right? I'm gambling a little bit on the freeze, but like, I don't know I'm gonna lose, right? Like it's not the northern part of the county. And one thing I'll say to be really aware of with these USDA plant hardiness zones is they do minimum winter temperature. They don't tell you anything about summer temperature. They don't tell you anything about whether the nights are nice and cool and good for a plant or warm and humid and terrible, right? That's not in these maps. And so if you were to look at where we are in North Carolina, it's actually very similar in a lot of ways to parts of Oregon. As you learn more and more and more, you might go back up the chain a couple times to understand those broader relationships. But typically, if I know family genus and species, I kind of know who's related to who and who's kind of doing the same thing. So a great example of common names that can be misleading, right? So we have Vinca and Periwinkle, right? These can often look very, very similar, and they're often actually called interchangeably. A lot of times we'll see, like, it's like there's an annual Vinca, and then there's true Vinca, and it can just be really, really confusing between these two. You often don't know which one you're quite talking about, and they're really, really different plants, right? So Vinca minor is a hardy evergreen ground cover. It's going to stick around forever. It's going to have these purple flowers, whereas this is always fun to do in front of a group. Cartharanthus roseus. You just got to say it with conviction, you guys. Anyone can say scientific names. Just like get on that dragon and ride it, right? Like just say it with conviction. These are heat-tolerant, tender perennials, right? So these are guys that are going to be tender and they're going to have a little bit of a hard time when it gets too cold out. Whereas this guy, like, doing a great job.
No, invasive.
Well, yeah, doing a great job. we disagree with the job it's doing, but from its perspective, it's killing it. Okay, so genus and species. This is where most of us are going to start. Family's kind of your gold star at this point. Genus is the larger group, and it's always capitalized and italicized. There are rules for how you write these names. Get the name, then learn the rule, right? It's more important that you got the name than that you got, like, if it's not italicized, I'll still know, right? Like, it's fine. I'll always put that together. And then species is what is considered the specific epithet, right? So you can almost think of these as being flipped. Like, this is your first name, and this is your last name, right? Just the order is reversed. So the specific epithet is going to be specific to one plant and genus, right? So, like, this to the point where it doesn't really happen much, and a lot of times there will be intermediate crosses along the way to make it work. They are often written as genus X, right? So you can see this as genus X, genus cross, genus bi. That's typically how you'll see that. So something like this witch hazel over here, we have Hamamelis bi intermedia. So that's how I would pronounce that, Hamamelis bi intermedia. So this is going to be Hamamelis japonica by Hamamelis mollis. If I don't need all this information, if I just see Hamamelis cross, I know it's a cross in that group. I know it's not probably truly a native, right, because it's been crossed to create a new form that is distinct from either of the original forms. So even though both parents might be from the area, if I see a cross, I know it might be different, and pollinators and things might not recognize it the same way. Talking about cultivar names, oh my god, you guys, you're going to be like pros on names by the end of this. Or you're just going to be like, I don't want to think about names anymore. Either way, it's fine. You'll know that you've seen it. Okay, this like sidebar, real quick. One of the things about this class, you're not going to remember a tenth of what we tell you. But you'll have seen it. And you'll know it exists. And when someone asks you about it, you're like, I have an inkling that that is a real thing that you're asking me about. And you'll be able to go look it up, right? Because you'll be like, that's in a book, or like someone knows that. That's a real thing that you're asking me. So just take the pressure off that you have to remember all the things. We're just trying to make sure you've seen all the things so that you have a reference for later, okay? So these are names given to a selected variety of a plant. We put together an interesting little publication on this, but I'll just do it really quick. So cultivar. What is that? Where did that word come from? It's a cultivated variety, right? Selected variety. That is something a human made, right? It wasn't out there, and then we cultivated it, and we got that variety. Sometimes you will also see the term nativar, right? If you go deep into the natives world. That is a cultivated native variety. That plant might not be that similar anymore to its true wild form, right? We might have selected things about it, pollinators, the insects that eat it, whatever else don't recognize anymore. It's still a variety that has human selection, right? So if I wanted the true native, I would be looking for something that is a true native, wild type, right? Something that doesn't have a variety name. That's how I know I've got a true native that is the ecologically relevant plant, right? So all plants with the same variety name are genetically identical, right? They're going to behave the exact same, they're going to do the exact same thing. A lot of times for a lot of our cultivars, they are even propagated by cutting, not by seed. We want them to be identical, and sometimes they can't even reproduce by seed anymore. We can take that away from them. They should be written with a single quote. They're like, here's when you use quotes. Here's when. So you would see that as something like genus, species, cultivar, right? So you have this Nandina domestica firepower. You could also call it a firepower Nandina, right? If you call it a firepower Nandina, we're going to know what you're talking about. If you're like, it's the Nandina that's real red, we'll help you narrow it down, probably. The majority of landscape plants are cultivars. The vast majority of landscape plants are cultivars. Anything that's got a fancy name on it, it's a cultivar, right? Again, if you're trying to plant a truly native garden, you want to be looking for things that just have genus species and have nothing beyond that. Those plants might not perform as well. Their growth might not be as good. They might not be as attractive. But an insect knows what they're looking at, right? And that's what we want with our native plants, is we want them to support all of the other things in our native habitats. Pat?
Could you say that again? I'm sorry to make a comment.
Yeah. So the idea of a native garden, to me at least, is to recreate native habitat, right? To support birds, insects, whatever else the critter wants to know, right? And so to pick a native plant, I want to pick one that does not have a variety name associated with it anyway. It's just a genus. be super attractive, but it is evolved to be in relation to the things around it, and that's actually how you rebuild that network, right? All these plants that we love because they don't get eaten, right? Things can't eat them. like that should tell you something, right? Like a plant that's good and beautiful never gets any edibles on it, I'm like, it is not supporting anything other than itself, which is fine. I think that there's a place for some of those in the garden for sure. But just be, like, don't kid yourself, right? Like, you can't have a coneflower that is never enabled and think that it's doing the same thing a native coneflower would do, right? And that just goes back to personal choice. Okay, plants can be patented. This is why there's certain plants you can't get from seed, even if seed's available, because they're patented. They will have a patent number listed after their name, and the patent will typically last for about 20 years. This is common, especially with some of our ornamentals and flowers, things like that. Names can also be trademarked. They'll be marked with like the trademark or the registered. And often plants are heavily marketed under their trademark name to the point where you might not know their real name, right? Because they have some other like weird name that was given to them by whoever created them, and then they came up with the trademark name to actually sell them, right? The reason that people do this is because there's a huge amount of time and energy invested in creating those new varieties, and like folks need to be able to recoup that money, right? So it's just like medicine development or anything else like that, where you maintain the patent for however long you're allowed to, just because that's how you make your money, and then it goes out more broadly.
Give us some examples.
Hi, you're like, I need you right there. Just be like, Ashley, tell me about this. Okay, so knockout roses. Another one you'll see is encore azaleas, right? That's another real common one in this area. So something like these, you have the blushing knockout rose, radyard, right? The double knockout rose, radco, the pink knockout rose, radcon, right? What do these names actually mean, right? So they're all in the knockout rose family. There are different specific knockout roses. So their common name would be something like, and by a common name, I mean like what we all call it colloquially, right? Would be something like a knockout rose. Registered, right? If I was writing it.
Would peonies, these elegant peonies, come under this classification?
I don't know the elegant peonies specifically, but I bet a lot of times there will be families of plants that come out. So a whole new, like the bumblebee series of tomatoes, I believe, is in this group. Encore azaleas, the elegant peonies, they'll have these specific names. I don't know that exact example, but possibly, very possibly.
Tomatoes would be this kind of.
Some of them would, some of them wouldn't, depending on how old the varieties are.
I was going to say, I've seen things called heirloom tomatoes. Are those trademarked?
They are not the heirlooms. For the most part, the really old heirlooms are not trademarked anymore, but there are newer tomatoes, some of the hybrids, that will have some level of trademarking on them.
Big boy or?
No.
No?
Nope, not those guys. No. Yeah, because those are hybrids though, and so those are a different thing. We'll get into that when we talk about veggies. They're their own.
Okay.
Mind blower. Okay. So this guy, the knockout rose, what is he actually? He's a Rosa bihybrida. What does this mean when it says hybrida? What that actually means is that this thing has been crossed between so many different roses that they're not going to tell you that whole lineage. They're just going to say, it's a hybrid, right? Some of the hellebores, the Lenten roses that you buy, you'll see this like Helleborus bihybrida, and it's because there might be 6 species in that plant, right? All hybridized together, and they don't list all that, they just tell you it's a hybrid. The cultivar name is Rosa radraz, right? This is, if I was actually looking for the exact cultivar on this one, I'd be looking for a radraz rose or a radraz knockout rose, something like this. This is that name where I'm going to be able to tell the nursery exactly what I'm looking for. The registered trademark name, knockout. It's plant patent 11836, right? All of these names apply to this little plant, right? And so there are all these different ways of thinking about the way it's classified, especially because some of this is plant classification, right? Some of this is what I would consider more like business classification that got put on plants, right? So just be aware there can be a lot of different ways of thinking about this. Let's see where we are. We're gonna do a little bit more. Do you guys need a stretch for for like a 1 minute, or do you have a little bit more in you?
Keep going.
Keep going.
Okay. I heard one small stretch, and I was like, oh god, that person. I'm sorry. Okay. If you need a stretch, you can always stretch. Do you have a question?
Yeah, so this sounds like chances are, like, if you go and you buy something from Lowe's, like I bought a dahlia from Lowe's,
Yeah.
that is something that has been patented, has been trademarked, and like I potentially wouldn't. So for example, with the dahlia, like at the end of the season, I would like dig out the tuber and like store them or whatever. So chances are I'm not going to be able to do that with these tubers from Lowe's.
You can. You can. There's a distinction though.
Oh, but if I'm like, D's Farm and Garden, and I get those dahlias from Lowe's, and then I like store them and then try to sell them, Lowe's is gonna come for me.
Not Lowe's. Somewhere that breeder is going to hear it on the wind, right? My plant is being sold. No, but that's exactly the distinction. And this is one of the reasons why, so like our plant sale committee is very, very concerned with things like this, right? Because there are plants that are going to be under patented names and still under patent that we can't really sell. And so if you donate plant material to our plant sale, which, just saying, we'll want to know what it is. Because there are things we can't really sell because of those things, right? That's how that breeder protects their investment. However you want to feel about like patenting, right? But after that 20-year period, they pass back out and they come and comment you, right? And then your dahlia. So if you can get your dahlia, patented dahlia, last 20 years, then you're off to the races. I'm like looking at the camera. I don't believe, follow your heart, is what I'm going to say. Follow your heart, right? I don't think it's I'm not going to say, but follow your heart. I would, and I wouldn't, and like my distinction that I make, and I don't think this is a script distinction by any stretch of imagination, so like, your mileage may vary. There are plants I have that I will propagate for myself and I will give away, but I will not sell, right? And I have plants, for example, that maybe I've gotten from like slightly shady origins, and I don't mean like low sell, that I don't put in the plant sale that I'll give away, right? Because I know where I got them from, and I'm like, I'm not trying to make money off of that, but this is a beautiful plant that I'm going to have. Okay? Good question. No one knows what those are. All right, plant parts and their functions. So we're going to keep going on this for about another half hour. Wait, what time did we do it? 10:30? 10:30. Okay. Yeah, I know. So we're going to go on this for about another half hour, and then we're going to take our half hour break. We have snacks, all that stuff. So don't worry, like, the midpoint's in sight, you guys. All right, plant parts and their functions. Roots. I love roots. Roots are the most absolutely underrated part of the plant. If your roots aren't right, nothing's right. We have one of our upcoming lectures is entirely about soils. I have a talk I do about soils. I want to talk to you about soil. Like, that is like my thing I enjoy doing. We don't think about roots nearly enough. This is really what we're trying to grow. We're trying to grow good, healthy roots. And if we have good, healthy roots, those things follow from that. Some of their major functions are just for straight up anchoring the plant. But more importantly, they absorb water in minerals, right? This is how the plant takes up the vast majority of what it needs to grow its body, nitrogen, carbon, and all of the other nutrients for the most part is going to get used. They can store food, they can serve as a support system, they kind of do everything, right? They're I love, it's like one of my favorite new facts, is that carrots, I knew they were very, very closely related to Queen Anne's lace. I did not realize they were the same species, right? Like where I was just like, oh my God, like mind blown. So I typically don't even grow carrots for carrots. I grow carrots for carrot flowers because I think they're pretty, but that's because I love Queen Anne's lace, which I was like, oh, that makes sense, right? Like that was so funny. Which one? Yeah. Oh, I haven't heard of that. How'd you? Yeah. Yep, yep. Yeah. I'll have to look that up. That's crazy. Yeah, I want to see this. There's always something coming here. Okay. Yeah, because the one that we did that's the close resemblance, although it's, you probably don't have it, like, you probably don't have it, is hogweed. And so giant hogweed is one that's like, my favorite call I've got. So giant hogweed, it looks like a carrot flower, but, you know, it's this big, it's giant, as you might guess. It's so funny. I, like, got a call maybe 2 years ago that someone was like, I've got giant hogweed, you know, like alert USDA or whoever it is. And I was like, oh my God, you know, and I like, I'm talking to a walker, and I'm like, where do you have it? I have it in my garden bed. Oh man, what else is going around it? Nothing. Grow anything there last year? Carrots. Wait a minute. How tall is it? It's about carrot height. I'm like, oh, I think you have carrots. So, like, you know, problem solved.
Giant hogweed grow maybe 8 or 10 feet tall.
Yeah, but we don't have reports of it yet in this area.
I got a friend, front row again. He is carrot.
Really?
Yeah.
I want pictures. I want pictures.
It's got about,
Yeah.
give me a chance to visit it.
Then there it is. See?
Very,
The power of
very
gardening.
close.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, I love talking about all that. All right, root growth. So this goes back to this idea of plant cells don't move; they just attach more cells at the end, right, and then they get stuck. So roots grow just the way that shoot tips grow, by adding cells to the tip, right, what we call the meristem. So there are root meristem, there are shoot meristem. The meristem is always that really active growth point at the very tip of a shoot. Yeah. So, sorry, I'm like trying to think about it. I believe that's right. But it could do a similar thing. So what we're talking about here is, so the root, or so the meristem in general, whether you're talking about a root or a shoot, right? Whether I'm talking about a root or a twig or whatever else I'm talking about. This meristem, if I were to stain this for plant hormones, it will just go dark blue, right? Like it is very, very, very active growth at that point. And what it does is not only does it encourage growth at that point, there's actually specialized populations of stem cells right here that are differentiating in all of the different tissues, and they keep getting pushed out, so they keep being stem cells and being able to differentiate. Same thing's happening on that shoot tip. It's also letting off all these hormones, telling back up that root, hey, I'm number one, I'm the big grower, let me keep growing. The moment it gets cut off and those hormones are no longer being supplied, you'll start getting branching out, right? In the same way that on a plant, right? If I come and if I cut the main stem, it starts pushing out, right? It starts branching out a lot. And that's because that main stem at the very top was telling all the little stems beneath it, hey, I'm number one, you guys like stay in line. It's cut out. One of them is like, oh, it's gonna be me, right? Like I'm gonna be number one. So they all will branch out and push out, right? This is why.
So, like having the central flower on jelly, which kind of come up.
Yeah.
Easy to cut that middle one off and you can put a
exact opposite. We're trying to train for one central leader to get a really good form, but on most of our lower plants, we're actually trying to get bushier, so we cut out those central leaders. I'm going to look that up, though. I haven't looked at the root diagram in a while to know if that's also technically considered an apical meristem. It feels like the requirements, but I'm not sure if it's the exact term that we either. Yeah. We also have root hairs. These are very, very, very important. The vast majority of what you see on roots that we think of as roots, that's not actually what's doing the action, it's root hairs. It's all these super fine structures we can barely see. So they greatly increase the root surface area. They are what actually absorbs the majority of nutrients. And they can live just a few days to a few weeks. They're very, very short-lived. So if I were to dig up a plant and I see that whole root structure, what I'm not seeing is actually an even finer structure that's there too, that's really what's doing all the kind of nutrition type work, right? The roots I can see are helping to anchor the plant, maybe pull up a little bit of water. Those root hairs are what's really pulling up everything else. On something like a tree, we have permanent root systems and we have feeder roots. So permanent roots are these really large structural roots. They support and they anchor and they conduct some amount of water and minerals, but that's not really what they're great at. What they're really great is supporting and anchoring. And just a note on trees specifically, some of you might have heard before that a tree's roots go out as far as drip line, right here. They go out much further than that. You can think of a tree as basically being a wine glass on a dinner plate, right? So it's like this, and then it goes out, pretty wide actually. Those roots go out much wider than we used to think they do, and they actually don't go very deep at all, right? They're going out in every single direction to anchor that thing. That's why a lot of times we have a lot of rain, and then we have heavy wind. Even a healthy looking tree can come down because it catches all of this up here. The wind catches in there and can push the tree, right? So that's always the most dangerous point for a tree is when we've had a lot of rain for a long time and then we have heavy winds. Some of the feeder roots, these absorb water and nutrients even better. They're typically short-lived. They can be found about the top 12 inches of soil. They grow up and down, and they are most concentrated at the drip line, but they, again, go out even further than that. The feeder roots are why you need to be really, really careful with any sort of heavy machinery, compaction, and anything else like that around a tree, is because when you start putting, especially construction, you'll see things dropped off around trees and just left there, and they compact that soil, and they're messing up the feeder roots, basically. And so that tree will have a hard time recovering. Even if you don't think you hit the tree specifically, you hit the roots, and that's the tree. Because I think roots are cool, I think we should talk about mycorrhizae. So these are the fungal relationships that extend the roots even further. So I think this is so cool. So what happens basically is that you have these tree roots coming out, and then you have these fungal mycorrhizae. These are like fungal roots. You can think of them kind of like that. These are fungal roots, and they form relationships with the tree roots. And so the tree roots basically give the fungus carbohydrates, right? So the tree is spending all this time making sugars using its leaves. It gives the fungus those sugars, and then the fungus in return gives water and mineral nutrients, right? So the fungus is spread much further than the tree. It can find water, it can find minerals, it can find everything the tree wants. It gives those to the tree in exchange for sugars, right? So this is actually why it's really, really important to have a good, healthy, living soil, because these relationships are really hard to set up, right? You'll find, like at the garden store, they're like, mycorrhizae in a bag. And you're like, kind of like probiotics, right? Where, yes, we need a good, healthy biome. No, that probiotic is probably not going to be what gives it to you because it might be dead, maybe it wasn't stored properly, maybe it was never formulated properly, maybe it's not the bacteria you needed, right? It's better just to take care of the entire environment, to take care of the soil, and then those fungi are already present, right? And then they can form those relationships. Weird side note, brassicas do not form these relationships. So things like kale, Brussels sprouts, all those green leafy vegetables we grow, that's like the thick green leafy vegetables, they just don't do this. They've decided they don't need it, and they're figuring out other things, which I think is really cool. So this really can quite dramatically extend the reach, right? So the roots on this little guy are right about here. This is all just fungal relationships. To the point where there's research being done now where this is something I love talking about. And then they also transport food, water, and minerals. And so a lot of what we think about on the stem is kind of what we see, but what's actually really important is what's going on the inside, right? That vascular tissue. You can think of this as it's sort of like blood and veins and all that sort of stuff, right? So, thinking about xylem first. Xylem transports water and minerals from the roots to the leaves. I think of the xylem as being water, and water is picked up by the roots and it moves up. It actually moves up through a process called transpiration we'll talk about later, but basically you have water moving up the plant. Phloem transports food. I am a simple person, so I think phloem food, that's the same sound, that makes sense to me, right? So phloem transports that food largely from the leaves to the rest of the plant, but phloem can move in multiple directions in a way that xylem tends to move up, whereas phloem can move slightly differently than that, depending on what season the plant's in, right? So for example, in the fall, when the plant is sending all of its sugars back down to the roots for storage, the phloem is going to move down. In the spring, when it's trying to rebuild all those leaves and rebuild all those structures, right, it needs to send all that energy back out, right? So it will move slightly differently at different times. This is an example of, let me get out of the way, the vascular bundles in a tree stem. So what you have here is you have the xylem on the outside. You actually have the phloem right here on the inside. I don't know if you can tell, but this is actually a little ring. These are called vascular bundles, right? You can see them right here. And you have an active growth area called the cambium in between them. But they're very, very organized. In the grasses, they're all higgledy-piggledy. They're just like everywhere. In the broadleaf plants, they are organized. Vascular tissue more broadly. In woody plants, it's found just beneath the bark, right? And so if you were to take a cross-section of a tree, for example, you know we all think of tree rings. Those tree rings are actually that vascular tissue moving out each year. It's that dark line moving out. And so on many trees, this out here is essentially almost like dead tissue, and actually the center of the tree is more like dead tissue. The heartwood of the tree is more support than anything else. And all of the living action is happening right here at that layer just beneath the bark. This is true on trees, on some of our smaller plants, right? The whole thing is alive. But what to be aware of is if I ever have a tree or a shrub that I think has died and I'm like quite convinced it is dead, the easiest way to go out and check is you take your nail or a little knife and you just scrape off the outer layer of bark. Right underneath it is the cambium, this really active layer. And if it's still bright green or even got a little bit of green in it, you're good. Maybe that plant, it'll come back. If it's brown too, I don't know what else to tell you, right? So if you cut into this cambial layer, you can kill plants. This is why you can kill a massive tree just by cutting down about an inch all the way around, right? Because what you've done is you've cut that cambial layer, you've cut the vascular tissue, you've separated everything above that line from everything below that line. This is why we have to be really, really careful with things like hedge trimmers around young trees, right? Because if you knock the base of that tree, you could just kill it in a way that it can't recover from, right? So lightly scraping the bark off of woody stems, looking for bright green tissue especially. I tend to neurotically go around and do this in my shrubs in like February because I'm convinced everyone is dead. So I just kind of go around scraping until I find everyone's fine. It's just me. So the cambium is really this region of cell division. It's responsible for growth and diameter as well. This is how trees are able to grow out. It's called secondary growth. Other really, really, really important thing about the stems that we talked about a little bit already is this idea of nodes. So nodes are a different form of meristem. They're a different form of growth point. So the nodes are where buds and new growth form. So this is what I was talking about, where if I was staining basically for like all of the things that indicate rapid plant growth, right? It stains really heavily here. This is the apical meristem. This is the tip growth point. It also is going to stain really brightly on the sides, right there. So those are the kind of lateral meristems. So if this guy ever got cut off, these guys are going to go out, right? They are ready. This one is suppressing this one as long as it exists, but when it's removed, the other ones go for it. want to take a cutting node to try and propagate, you have to get this node, right? This node is chock full of different types of stem cells. And so what it can do is it can form roots too a lot of the time, which is crazy, but like that's how plants are. So you want to make sure you capture at least 2 to 3 nodes underground or underwater in your propagation, right? Because you need these guys to form those roots. The internode is just the space between the 2 nodes. A lot of times if we get leggy plants, so our internodes are too long, it's because they don't have quite enough light. That's the easiest, best way to do that. If you have really heavy light, a lot of times your internodes will get really short and tight. For example, I have a Dorothea in my backyard. My neighbor has an Dorothea in their front yard. Mine's shady, theirs is sunny. They almost don't look like the same plant, right? Because they've been growing in different light conditions for so long that theirs is really tight and compact. Mine's like, I like to think of it as graceful. Some people might think of it as leggy, you know. Okay, there are a couple different types of stems. So we have herbaceous. These are going to die down every year, right? Or herbaceous perennials. We have cane. These live 1 to 3 years, and they have a large pith in the center, so they have a large, more like an open in the center. Roses, brambles, berries, this sort of stuff. A lot of times on your berries, raspberries, blackberries, either the new canes or 1-year-old canes will be what produces the absolute best fruit. You just have to know which one yours does. And so you're selectively pruning to encourage those canes. Finally, woody stems. These are covered in bark. I mean, they're tree branches, right? Like, we've seen these before. This is not like a crazy technical term you've never seen. Yes? Yeah. There is still a tremendous amount of energy in those roots. So what's going to happen is they're going to keep sending up, right? And I would just go through and cut them all out too until I basically exhaust the plant. The reason you would girdle a plant is because, like, maybe I was not strong enough, I don't have the energy, I don't have the capacity to take it down by myself, and when it falls, it's not going to hurt anything, right? So then I might consider girdling it, because then I'm like, oh, whatever, I can just go through and do this, it's going to die. I need to come back and cut out those shoots that are coming up. I'm trying to exhaust the roots, basically, but I've killed the main stem. Does that make sense? Yeah. They'll send up those side roots for a while. After a while, they'll get tired, and because basically what happens. This is fun. I like plants. Okay, so so what happens is that the leaves produce sugars, and they send those sugars down to the roots, and they're stored in the roots. And every time that plant has to make new stems, new structures, it has to pull those sugars back up from the roots. And so what happens is when you girdle the plant, you take all those leaves out, and you destroy all that tissue. And the plant's like, oh my god, I have to do it again, right? And it sends those sugars up. And so if you can cut those new ones out before they form leaves, that was wasted energy on the tree's part. So then it'll do it again, and it wastes the energy, right? To the point where then it has nothing to draw from anymore, and then it will get exhausted and die. But you're trying to make sure that it never has leaves, because the leaves are what kind of like keep the show running. Does that make sense? So like one of the classic stories in this part of the United States, right, is the loss of the American chestnut. Because they are impacted by a disease that always hits them basically at a certain size. The thing a lot of people don't realize is that we actually still have a lot of small chestnuts around, because when those trees died decades ago, they died at a certain size up. The roots are still alive, and the roots are continuing to send up small trees. But because every single time one of those branches
Does the blood go around with the vegetation? How does it know that?
It's something about actually, it's not the height, it's the diameter of the stem, that when it's at a certain point, that is where the chestnut blight is effective at killing. So it can kill anything above a certain size. I don't know how it knows, but it's like any disease, right, where it targets certain ages, basically. Yeah. All right, so modified stems. This is important to know for how plants spread. A lot of times if we have creeping plants, they have either stolons or rhizomes. So stolons are above ground runners. This is like what strawberries would have, right? Those above ground stems. Rhizomes grow just at or below ground level. And so the way I remember this for myself, these are both modified stems, but I think of stolons as stems and rhizomes as roots. Stolons are above ground, rhizomes are just below ground, right? It's a pretty arbitrary distinction in real life, right? This is something like a botanist wants to impose. The plant doesn't know that it just cuts slightly above ground with its rhizome, right? So rhizomatous and stoloniferous plants can be aggressive spreaders. So just be aware of that. These guys are really, really good at spreading over the ground, right? Like that's the whole point of these structures, is to know how to spread. And so that can be good if it's what you want, and it can be really frustrating if it's not. Yeah. Yeah, it's like white clover in the lawn. Yeah, exactly. And we wish they could all be irises. They are not all irises. We also have a number of different modified stems that are really kind of interesting and specialized. These are really just to store energy in the dormant season and to allow plants to survive harsh conditions. So what am I talking about? I'm talking about tubers, horns, bulbs, rhizomes, right? All of these are basically, you can think of them as just food and energy storage, right? The plant is I'm just going to shove it all right there. It's going to get real big, and that's my plant, right? That's where I'm storing it. Which is kind of cool. So for buds, buds are really just undeveloped shoots. This is a bud. This is a bud, right? You can always tell when spring's finally coming and you're getting excited because your flower buds start swelling and you know they're about to open. This is a resting state. There can be leaf buds, which are vegetative, and there can also be flower buds. And the way to tell the difference is really that flower buds are typically rounder, whereas leaf buds are typically much pointier and narrower. Dogwood has a very, very, very distinctive flower bud. I mean, you can see it. It looks like a little Hershey Kiss almost or something, right? They're really cool. I always like watching my dogwoods in the spring to see when the buds finally start swelling. When buds start swelling and even what we call breaking, bud break is when that bud finally fully opens, right? This is actually a major area of study for a lot of biologists because it's one of the best ways to track climate change, right? Because a lot of this is very, very dependent on temperature. And so there are numerous studies that have been going for 30, 40 years where they have tracked what they call bud break across, for example, eastern forests, across all these different habitats. And so they know when does bud break happen every single year. Because if bud break is happening earlier and earlier and earlier, spoiler alert, it means that everything is kind of getting strained, right? Because bud break happens in response to the environment and in response to warming. But things like bird migration might happen in response to different environmental cues. But if the birds and the insects expect things to be available at certain times based on environmental cues that used to be synced to temperature, but now they're falling apart, it means that you can have flowers opening, you can have everything else opening, and whatever the pollinator that was needed isn't there. Whatever the bird thought it was going to get for lunch when it was migrating isn't there, right? So this is actually a really interesting field of study. It's called phenology. Dormancy is what they're in until they break buds. It's just a state of reduced cellular activity. Dormancy is typically triggered and broken by things like moisture, day length, temperature. This is actually one of the coolest things I think that perennials do. I think this does not get enough press. So we as humans, when we grow, early on we are not reproductive, and then we 80 degrees and you're so, like 70, and you're so happy. And then all the plants start flowering and you're like, oh no, no, no. It's not actually over. Like I know it's over. You seem confused. Okay, so in the southern US, right, kind of where we are, we like to be somewhere in this sort of area for chilling hours. So what do I mean when I say chilling hours? They're the number of hours of cold weather that a plant needs to get before it can break dormancy. And so it seems counterintuitive, but it's actually good for us to have a pretty good number of chilling hours, 800 to 1,000. So that's 800 to 1,000 hours that are above 32 but below 42 or 45 before the plant can break dormancy. What do I mean? This is kind of a hard concept, at least it was for me at first. I want a plant that will get 1,000 chilling hours before it can break dormancy because I don't want it to be confused in February. I want it to be like, oh, I've only had like 700 chilling hours, so even though it's 70 degrees out, I'm not ready to go. I need 300 more chilling hours. I need the rest of the cold months chilling hours before I break dormancy. Because what happens if that doesn't happen is we get all of our, like every fall you'll see some number of ornamental cherries flower, right? Yeah, or red buds will go for it, and you're like, we're not doing that yet, right? Because the problem is what they'll do is they'll put out all their flowers. For ornamental plants, it ruins show, which is frustrating. For things like fruit trees, it ruins fruit, right? And all those flowers get lost. So especially when I'm picking fruit trees for this area, I'm looking for something with at least 800 to 1,000 chilling hours required, and any reputable fruit tree seller will have that listed, right? Anything less than that, and you could well get flowers in February. You can get flowers in February.